Hi everyone, and welcome to this screencast in our senior seminar class. Today I want to take a look at Chapter 1 in our David Allen book, Getting Things Done. What I'm hoping to do here is just to offer a few insights and maybe a few takeaways that I have from this chapter, and then of course have all of you continue the discussion and talk about your own takeaways in the Slack channel. This first chapter is giving us still a rather 30,000-foot view of what it is that David Allen is attempting to do in this book. So it's still kind of a bird's eye approach to things, and he'll drill down into the weeds a little bit more as we get further into the book. One of the things that you'll find as you read through this is that there's a fair amount of repetition. He continues to come back to principles over and over again just to help kind of define them and get them into your head and help you to begin to develop habits that will put some of these principles into place. So don't be concerned about that. If you see these things come up over and over again, it's a typical way to try to drive home some of the ideas that you find here. So one of the first things that I would mention about this book is the three key principles, the three key objectives that he has for this book. And so I think you'll find those on page 4 of the text, but it's important to just note these and highlight them for a second. So there's three objectives, overarching objectives that he'd like to accomplish as people work through this system. The first one, and we saw this in the Fallows article, is capturing all the things that might need to get done, capturing all those things. And this is one of those areas where you can begin to think about your system. He says you want to be able to capture these things in a logical and trusted system outside your head. And one of the questions that I would pose to you right away is, what is that system that you currently use to capture stuff that comes to you? So you might have an analog method for doing this, maybe a notebook or something, a date timer, a calendar, or whatever that might be. You might have digital sources that you use, apps on your phone, things like that, a notes app, a reminders app, a Google Doc. If you're like most people, one of the ways that you capture these things that come to you is in your head. And what he's trying to do in this system is to get you to not do that anymore. So to capture stuff and get it into a trusted system that is outside of your head. So as you work through the material here, you want to think about these tools, what you currently use and how you might tweak them to make them a little bit better. What apps, what system, if you're an analog person and like pen and paper, what's the best way? Think of it this way. What is the tool that you have in your possession right now that if you lost it or if it went away, your life would be a wreck? Is it a notebook? Is it an app? Something like that. If you lost this thing, then your life would be a mess. You'd have a difficult time reconstructing what it is you need to do. And you might say, well, I don't have anything like that. And that's because it's all in my head. So think about that. Think about how you might be able to tweak it. So capturing things, that's one of the key objectives here. The next one is directing yourself to make front-end decisions about all the inputs you let into your life so that you'll always have a workable inventory of next actions. There's that word again, next actions. So directing yourself to make front-end decisions about all the next actions that you have. That's another key element of this system. And then the third one is curating and coordinating. And what he means by that is, just organizing all of the various content that you have into, again, a system where you'll be able to figure out what are some of the priorities that I have to do, what is the stuff that I have to do now, what is the stuff that can be put off to later. So that's the first thing that I'd highlight is those objectives. Just take a look at those. The other point that I'd make here, and it's actually on the next page, is the changing nature of the work that we have these days. There are no longer clear boundaries between work, our personal lives, and the fact that our careers, our jobs, these sorts of things change on a fairly regular basis. And I want to make it clear here that these are the sorts of things that you should expect down the road. Our careers, our jobs, they're probably going to change down the road. I always try to make a distinction between what we typically refer to as a vocation, a calling, which is way more serious and usually involves vows, things like getting married and stuff like that, versus a career, which changes, sometimes pretty regularly. And we live in a world right now where those careers do change on a pretty rapid basis, and so we need to be prepared for that, and we need to not necessarily be stressed out about that. And as he says on page 7, organizations themselves are now almost in universally morph mode with ever-changing goals and products and partners. So that's the world that we live in. And so having something like this system in place that you can keep all those balls spinning around is a great thing to have. The other thing I'd mention here early on in this chapter is how he talks about the way in which we live out of our inbox often, our inboxes, whether that be email or messages or however you do your communication. This is an important thing, and we need to be somewhat careful about this. He says on page 9 that more and more people's jobs and lives are made up of hundreds of emails and texts a day, with no latitude left to ignore a single request, a complaint, an order, a communication from company or family. There are few people who can expect to code everything based on its priority. We live in a world where email and communication lists tend to drive what we do. And again, having a place where you can curate and organize all that stuff and think about it is one of the key elements here. Another point that he makes in this first chapter is the ability, or in our case, often inability, to focus, and how that's hindered by the distractions of life. He makes a point on page 11 and 12 about having this kind of ready state mind of the martial artist. He compares this to a martial artist, a karate person. But those of you that are in sports may kind of understand what he's talking about when he describes this mind-like water focus that people have in the work that they do or their sports. You just kind of get in the groove. And that's an interesting way to look at it. We have a difficulty here when it comes to focusing. And then sometimes when things come into our life, we react, we overreact, we underreact. I like on page 12 where he talks about the way sometimes you might overreact to an email that comes to you. If you've ever been in a situation where somebody has asked you to do something and you've kind of flipped out, or somebody sent you an email and you've responded with 100 pages of text in your email that just went way, way over the top. He says on the bottom of page 12, anything that causes you to overreact or underreact can control you, and often does. Responding inappropriately to your email, your thoughts about what you need to do, your children, your boss, it leads to ineffective results. And most people, he says, give either more or less attention to things than they deserve simply because they don't operate with a mind like water. So that ability to focus on our work is one of the key elements to this system. And the fact of the matter is, our ability to focus is hindered by so many different distractions, dings on our phone calls that come in at the last minute, emails, whatever they might be. Often the distractions are digital, frankly, in our life. But those are the things that help us or hinder us from staying focused on the work that we have to do. So Alan wants us to get into a state of mind that is stress-free. I want to highlight again the subtitle of this book, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity. This is not just about how to get things done. It's about how to do it in a way that's stress-free. I can give you a little example here. I advise students, of course, in my job all the time. And there's sometimes that students come in and they really, really want to talk to me about something. And I just am not focused. I'm not there with them. I'm not listening to them. My mind is on something else. It's on, this oil change that I have to do in my car, or it's on a conversation that I had with my wife that was upsetting, or it was a kid that I'm concerned about, or maybe I got a call from somebody who is sick or had to go to the hospital. There are all kinds of things that come into our lives that distract us and help us or hinder us from staying focused on the things that we can do. And I think a big part of what David Allen's system is trying to do is to make sure that everything is in a place where we can be focused on those that need us. So it could be a child, it could be a colleague at work, it could be a roommate. But when someone comes to me and wants to talk to me about something, I want to make sure that I'm there, that I'm listening to them. And if you've ever been in a position where you've been talking to somebody and you look at their face and you know, this person's not paying any attention to me at all, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And there are legitimate reasons, as I said, why people might be in that situation. They've, got some bad news or whatever. So I'm not excusing that, and I'm not necessarily justifying it, but there are reasons why people might lose that focus. And so, being able to operate and get the things that we need to get done in a world that is stress-free, where we have this kind of mind-like-water approach to our productivity, can be extremely useful and helpful. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to take a minute or two and just ask you to do a little exercise. And so after I walk you through this here, I'm going to ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you to turn off this recording, do this little exercise, jot it down on a piece of paper, something separate from like the Slack channel or whatever. Do it on a separate sheet of paper. But then when you're finished with this, I want you honestly to be able to take what you wrote down and post that to the Slack channel on Chapter 1. I'd like to see what students are doing and what students are thinking about with regard to these points that I'm going to ask you, these questions I'm going to ask you. This exercise, by the way, is found on page 14 and 15. But these are the things I'd like you to do, okay? So the first thing I'd like you to do is to write down a project. This is the bottom of page 14. Write down a project or a situation right now that most interests you. Okay, so something that's on your mind right now, a project, a problem, an issue, a circumstance, whatever it might be, but something that is, as he says, in your face right now, something that you're being pressed to handle, or a situation you need to deal with. Okay, I want you to write that down. What is that? Just a sentence or two. Write that down. What that is. Then second, after you finish that, I want you to describe, as he says on page 15, in a single written sentence, your intended successful outcome for this problem or situation. In other words, as he says on page 15, what does done look like? So whatever this situation is, whatever this problem is, whatever this project is that's bugging you, that's on your mind, what does done look like? What does it look like to have this completed? And that would be just a sentence or two. So take a second and write that down as well. Then thirdly, what I'd like you to do is, with regard to that project or situation that's bugging you, number 3, I'd like you to write down the very next physical action required to move that situation or project or issue forward. Again, this is on page 15. Now, after you finish with this exercise, I think what you need to appreciate about this is what Allen is trying to get us to do with regard to the work, with regard to the things that are stressing us out most, is he's trying to get us to think about our work, something that we rarely do until we have to put a fire out, until something is due. Think about this in the context of a college project, an assignment, a paper. particularly a big one. You know, you got a big term paper you have to write or something like that, and we wait till the very, very last minute, usually a week before it's due, and we plow through this with a singular focus to try to get this knocked out, okay? Rather than sort of thinking about it early on and addressing those questions of what are the individual action items that I need to do to accomplish something, we tend to put it off because it's complicated. It's complicated. So we put it off and put it off and put it off, and then just before the fire gets lit, we rush in and we do the project. Okay, that's our typical way of operating. When I was in college, I did this all the time and was relatively successful. But it's also something that totally stresses us out because all along you're thinking in the back of your head, boy, I got this thing I've got to do. I've got this thing I've got to do. And man, what am I going to do and how am I going to do it? But instead of actually taking a few minutes and just thinking about it, we put it away to the side and don't address it until we actually have to do it. So I hope that you will find that through that little exercise that you just did about that project that is in fact stressing you out, hoping that you found out that, wow, just thinking about this for just a second helped me to clarify what I need to do to advance this project forward, even just a little bit. I always tell people, you know, when it comes to eating an elephant, the way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. It's not something that you can do at the last minute all at once. You need to do it in little chunks. But it sort of releases a bit of stress, I find at least, when I think about a project and I think about what's the next action that I need to do. And maybe that's just a small action, like go visit a website or make a phone call or send an email to somebody, you know, whatever it might be. It just relieves a little bit of stress knowing that it's that one little thing and I can do that one little thing. That's not a problem. So I feel like, okay, I can get that done, and that stress level starts to come down. The point here is we need to think about our work. Now, this thinking comes in a number of forms. One of the things that he talks about is the way in which we use checklists. I think this is kind of interesting on page 18 and 19. So he uses checklists as an example, you know, and if you use checklists like I do, so often those checklists are really worthless. They make me feel better because I have them, but they're kind of worthless. So look at what he says on page 19. He says, almost all the to-do lists I have seen over the years were merely listings of stuff, not inventories of the resultant real work that needed to be done. They were partial reminders of a lot of things that were unresolved and as yet untranslated into outcomes and actions. That is, the real outlines and details of what the list maker had to do. Typical things that you'll see on a to-do list, things like, quote, mom, or, quote, bank, or, quote, doctor, or babysitter. Looking at these often creates more stress than relief because though it's a valuable trigger for something that you've committed to do or decide something about it, it still calls out psychologically, decide about me, right? What is it that you need to do with mom? Or what is it that you need to do at the bank? Or what is it that you need to do about your doctor? You know, think about this. What is this stuff that you need to do? He says at the conclusion of one of my seminars on the bottom of page 19, a senior manager of a major biotech firm looked back at the to-do list that she had come up with and said, boy, that was an amorphous blob of undoability. And I love that quote. And if you're like me or others, I'm sure, our lists, our to-do lists, our checklists are often like that. They are an amorphous blob of undoability, largely because we have not thought about what it is that we have to do. So at the end, one of the key takeaways from this chapter is found on page 20, I think, where he says, and he talks about managing your actions. That's such a key thing. I love where he says, you know, we have all these self-help books that talk about time management, right? And he says, you know, you don't manage 5 minutes and wind up with 6. Time is not something that you can manage. You don't manage information overload. Otherwise, you'd walk into a library and die, or the first time you connect to the web, you'd blow up. You don't manage priorities. You have priorities. So what Alan says is the key to managing all this stuff, to thinking about it and putting it all in, curating it, coordinating it, the key to managing all your stuff is managing your actions. That's the key takeaway from, I think, from this first chapter. Okay? You can't do a project. You can only do an action related to a project. That's a really, really good point. So managing those actions becomes a key element in this process. So those are the few thoughts that I have about chapter 1. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. And again, he'll do a deep dive into some of this stuff more particularly as we move through the various chapters. But please post any comments or insights or takeaways that you have in the Slack channel. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So that's all I've got for now. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.